Nothing is wrong with her, she's just being dramatic. She's not! Help her! Wake up! Please wake up!
Epileptic black girl ignored mid-flight. And moments later, so dad shuts down entire airline in a way that proves sometimes the child racists refuse to help during a medical emergency has a father powerful enough to ground operations and destroy careers with consequences that reach from 30,000 feet to courtrooms where flight attendants face criminal charges for deciding a black girl's seizure wasn't worth their time or compassion. She's just being dramatic, probably faking it for attention. You people always do this kind of thing to get special treatment. I'm not wasting my time on whatever show she's putting on. A flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin of Delta Airlines Flight 3241 bound for Miami with contempt so pure it felt like violence. Her white face twisted with disgust as she looked down at a 12-year-old black girl named Maya Carter who was convulsing in her seat, her body jerking with the unmistakable movements of an epileptic seizure while her 14-year-old brother Isaiah held her and screamed for help that apparently wasn't coming because this flight attendant whose name tag read Christine Morrison had decided that a black child's medical emergency was probably fraud, probably performance, probably anything except the life-threatening crisis it actually was. The words hit Isaiah like physical blows, each syllable landing with the weight of disbelief because surely an adult whose job was passenger safety wouldn't refuse to help a seizing child, surely medical emergencies transcended racism, surely someone having a seizure would trigger the training and protocols that flight attendants were supposed to follow. But Christine's face showed no concern, no urgency, just irritation at being bothered and suspicion that this was somehow a scam rather than his sister's brain misfiring in ways that could kill her if she didn't get proper care. She has epilepsy, Isaiah shouted, his voice breaking with terror and desperation. I told you when we boarded. I showed you her medical documentation. She needs help right now. She needs a safe place for her head. She needs someone who knows what they're doing. Please, you have to help her. And he looked around the cabin at other passengers hoping someone would intervene, would demand that the flight attendant do her job, would recognize that a child was in crisis and needed immediate assistance. This wasn't history. This wasn't his parents' stories about segregation and the civil rights era when black people couldn't get medical care at white hospitals. This was happening right now in 2025 aboard a modern aircraft where diversity training and anti-discrimination policies were supposed to ensure equal treatment, where medical emergencies were supposed to be addressed immediately regardless of the patient's race. But Christine Morrison had looked at Maya's black skin and her brother's black face and decided their crisis wasn't credible, wasn't urgent, wasn't worth her time or effort. And if you think racism died somewhere between the civil rights movement and today, if you believe we've evolved past letting black children suffer because adults decided their pain wasn't real, then you need to understand that hatred didn't disappear, it just learned to hide behind professional skepticism and claims about people faking emergencies, while inflicting the same deadly indifference it always has, maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we treat all patients equally, while people film on phones but don't intervene because surely the flight attendant knows what she's doing, surely there must be some reason she's not helping. Isaiah had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who assumed he was less capable despite being an honor student, store employees who followed him through aisles, adults who clutched their purses when he walked past, but watching his sister seize while a flight attendant called it drama felt different, felt like racism that could kill rather than just wound, felt like the moment when prejudice stopped being annoying and became lethal because medical neglect based on the assumption that black people exaggerate or lie about pain had killed before and was about to kill again if someone didn't intervene. He'd been shocked when Christine first dismissed Maya's seizure, had thought maybe she didn't understand what epilepsy looked like, but as the seconds turned into minutes and Christine continued insisting Maya was faking, he realized with sinking horror that this wasn't confusion, this was racism, this was exactly what his parents had warned him about when they'd hesitated to let him and Maya travel alone, and the recognition mixed with terrible familiarity because of course this was happening. Of course their blackness was making adults doubt their medical emergency. Of course, being excellent children with proper documentation wasn't protection. Other passengers were recording the scene on their phones, capturing Maya's convulsions and Isaiah's desperate pleas and Christine's dismissive hostility, but no one was helping, no one was demanding that the flight attendant provide care, no one was pushing the call button to summon other crew members, No one was stepping up to assist a child whose brother clearly couldn't handle this alone, and their silence felt like its own assault. Like permission for Christine to continue refusing aid. Like collective agreement that maybe this black girl was faking and helping her would make them look foolish. A white passenger in the row behind actually said loud enough for Isaiah to hear it might be contagious. Maybe we shouldn't get too close. Some of these diseases they bring on planes, and Isaiah wanted to scream that epilepsy wasn't contagious, wasn't a disease you could catch, was a neurological condition his sister had been managing for 3 years with medication and care. But his voice was locked in his throat by the need to focus on Maya, whose seizure was lasting longer than normal, longer than the 2 minutes that usually signaled the end, moving into dangerous territory where brain damage became possible. If you believe children in medical emergencies deserve help regardless of their skin color, keep watching, because what happens when this girl's CO father finds out will restore your faith that sometimes justice comes for those who let racism override their duty to save lives. And if you've ever been treated like you don't belong or your pain isn't real because of how you look, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when medical negligence meets a father with the power to shut down an entire airline's operations. This story doesn't end the way you think, so hit that like button if you stand against racism and subscribe to this channel, because we're exposing incidents that airlines pray never go viral. Isaiah pulled out his phone to call his parents, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen, and Maya's seizure continued while Christine Morrison stood there with her arms crossed watching a child suffer and apparently feeling no obligation to help, no urgency to act, no human compassion that might override the racism telling her that black pain was probably performance. And the seconds ticked by, carrying Maya closer to permanent injury while adults who should have saved her chose doubt over care, chose prejudice over protocol, chose comfort over courage in ways that would haunt everyone on that flight long after it landed. But to understand how 2 responsible honor students ended up trapped in a medical emergency with a flight attendant who decided their crisis was theater, how siblings who'd convinced their parents they were mature enough to travel alone ended up fighting for one's life while racism delayed the help that could save her, we need to go back 9 hours to a loving home in Chicago where this morning started not with terror but with excitement and a brother's promise that he would protect his sister no matter what. Isaiah Michael Carter, 14 years old, and Maya Grace Carter, 12 years old, were siblings who'd spent months convincing their parents that they were responsible enough to travel alone to Miami where their cousins lived, where a week of spring break adventures awaited. Isaiah was a freshman at King College Prep High School, an honor student who maintained a 3.9 GPA while playing varsity basketball and serving as class treasurer. Maya was a 7th grader at the same feeder middle school her brother had attended, equally excellent academically with a particular gift for creative writing that had won her several competitions and a scholarship to a summer program at Northwestern. Their mother, Dr. Jennifer Carter, was a pediatrician who worked long hours at a community health clinic serving low-income families, while their father, Marcus Carter, was CEO of Carter Technologies, a software company he'd built over 15 years into a major player in healthcare data management with contracts across the medical industry, including with several major airlines for passenger medical information systems. The siblings had a bond strengthened by Maya's epilepsy diagnosis 3 years earlier, a condition that had transformed Isaiah from typical older brother to fierce protector who'd learned everything about seizure management and emergency protocols, who carried her medication in his backpack, who knew exactly what to do when she had an episode and had successfully managed several at school and at home without adult help. Their mother had been reluctant to let them travel alone, had worried about what would happen if Maya had a seizure mid-flight, but Isaiah had promised he could handle it, had shown her the medical documentation he'd prepared, had explained he'd inform the flight crew immediately about Maya's condition, had convinced her that at 14 he was capable of caring for his sister the way he'd been doing for 3 years. Their father had supported Isaiah's argument, had said the kids needed to learn independence, that Maya couldn't let her epilepsy prevent her from living fully, that they'd be fine on a direct flight with proper preparation and documentation. That morning they'd woken early, too excited about their first solo trip to sleep late, and they'd packed their carry-ons with clothes and books and Maya's seizure medication in its clearly labeled prescription bottle, had triple-checked they had their boarding passes and identification and the unaccompanied minor forms their parents had prepared along with Maya's medical documentation explaining her condition and emergency protocols. Their father had driven them to O'Hare, using the drive to give them final instructions about staying together, checking in regularly, calling immediately if anything felt wrong, and most importantly making sure flight crew knew about Maya's epilepsy so they'd be prepared if she needed help. Check-in at the Delta counter had been smooth, the agent processing their tickets efficiently and commenting that they seemed like responsible young people, and security had been normal, TSA agents friendly and professional as they screened the siblings and their bags. They'd waited at their gate for an hour, doing homework and texting their cousins about arrival plans, and when boarding was called they'd walked onto Flight 3241 feeling proud of their independence, feeling mature and capable, expecting a routine flight that would prove to their parents they could handle travel without supervision. The plane was a newer 737 with comfortable seats, and they'd settled into row 15, Isaiah taking the aisle so he could get help quickly if Maya needed it, and they'd called their parents to say they'd boarded safely, called their cousins to say they'd see them in a few hours, their voices bright with the excitement of adventure. The initial flight crew had been professional, a young Latino man named Carlos who'd helped them stow their bags and had listened carefully when Isaiah explained about Maya's epilepsy, had said he'd make a note in the flight log, had seemed competent and kind. Then Christine Morrison had appeared, taking over their section from the boarding crew, and Isaiah had noticed immediately how her demeanor changed when she saw them, how her professional smile faded when she registered 2 black children sitting unaccompanied in economy, and he'd felt that familiar awareness that something was off, that this adult had made some judgment about them based on their appearance. When Isaiah had approached her to explain about Maya's epilepsy and show her the medical documentation, Christine had barely glanced at the papers before saying dismissively that she was sure it would be fine, that lots of people flew with medical conditions, that he shouldn't worry so much, her tone suggesting she thought he was being dramatic or overprotective. And Isaiah had felt the first stirring of concern but told himself he was probably reading too much into it, that she was just busy, that everything would be okay because Maya's seizures were usually well controlled by medication and stress management. But now his sister was seizing and Christine was refusing to help, and Isaiah understood too late that his instinct had been right, that this flight attendant's dismissiveness had been a warning sign he should have taken more seriously. Isaiah had felt the first stirring of concern but told himself he was probably reading too much into it, that Christine was just busy, that everything would be okay because Maya's seizures were usually well controlled by medication and stress management. But now his sister was seizing and Christine was refusing to help, and Isaiah understood too late that his instinct had been right, that this flight attendant's dismissiveness had been a warning sign he should have taken more seriously, and Maya's body continued its violent convulsions, her limbs jerking in the uncontrolled movements that signaled her brain was misfiring, that neurons were firing chaotically in patterns that could damage her permanently if the seizure didn't stop soon, and Isaiah held her as best he could while screaming at Christine, "Please, you have to help her. This is serious. She needs medical attention right now. She could die if this doesn't stop. Please, I'm begging you." Christine looked at Maya's seizing form with an expression that mixed skepticism and irritation, and she said again with even more certainty, "She's just being dramatic. I've seen kids fake seizures before to get attention. She'll stop when she realizes nobody's buying her act. You need to calm down and stop disrupting other passengers with this nonsense." And Isaiah felt rage cutting through his terror because how could an adult watch a child convulse and call it an act? How could professional training and basic human decency be so completely overridden by racism that decided black children's medical emergencies were probably fraud? "She has epilepsy," Isaiah shouted, his voice breaking. "I showed you the medical documentation. I told you when we boarded. This is a real seizure and it's lasting too long. She needs help positioning her head safely. She needs someone to time this. She needs emergency protocols. Please just look at her. Please see that she's really sick." Other passengers were watching now, some with phones out recording, some leaning into the aisle to see what was happening, and a white woman in her 50s 3 rows up said loudly it might be a contagious disease, some kind of infection, maybe we shouldn't get too close, I don't want to catch whatever she has, and her words spread fear through the cabin like wildfire, made people who'd been curious pull back. made the isolation around Maya and Isaiah even more complete as passengers decided that helping meant risking their own health. "It's not contagious," Isaiah said desperately, trying to address the entire cabin, trying to break through the ignorance and fear. "It's epilepsy. It's a neurological condition. You can't catch it. It's just her brain having electrical problems. She just needs someone to help me keep her safe while it passes. Please somebody help us." And his voice carried the particular desperation of a child who'd promised to protect his sister and was failing, who'd convinced his parents he could handle this, and was learning that preparation meant nothing when racism decided your emergency wasn't real. Minutes were passing. 3 minutes now since the seizure started, then 4, moving past the normal duration of Maya's episodes into dangerous territory where prolonged seizures could cause brain damage, could become status epilepticus that required immediate medical intervention to stop, and Isaiah could feel his sister's body temperature rising, could see her lips starting to turn slightly blue, could recognize signs that this was worse than her normal seizures, that the stress of travel or the altitude or just bad luck had triggered something more serious than what they usually managed at home. "Christine, please," Isaiah begged, tears streaming down his face now. "I know you don't believe me, but she's really sick. This seizure is lasting too long. Normal seizures stop after 2 or 3 minutes, and it's been longer than that. She could have permanent brain damage if someone doesn't help. Please, I don't know what else to do. I need an adult who knows medical stuff. Please get someone who can help her." Christine's face showed no softening, no recognition that maybe she was wrong, no willingness to err on the side of caution when a child's life might be at stake, and she said, "I'm not calling for medical assistance for a child who's clearly faking. You need to get control of your sister and stop this disruption," and she actually turned to walk away, to leave them there with Maya still convulsing, and Isaiah grabbed her sleeve saying, "You can't just leave us. She needs help," but Christine jerked her arm away saying, "Don't touch me. That's assault. And if you don't stop this behavior, I'm going to have to involve the captain about your conduct." The inversion was complete, the victim becoming the aggressor, the child begging for help becoming the problem passenger, and Isaiah felt the world tilting because nothing made sense anymore. Nothing followed the rules he'd been taught about how adults were supposed to protect children, how medical emergencies were supposed to trigger help, not hostility. 5 minutes into the seizure, Maya's movements were starting to slow slightly, but her eyes were still rolled back, still showing mostly white, and Isaiah knew from his training that this could mean the seizure was ending or could mean her brain was so exhausted it couldn't maintain the convulsions anymore, and he didn't know which, didn't know if slower movements meant improvement or deterioration, and the not knowing was almost worse than the seizing because at least violent convulsions were obviously a crisis, but this slower jerking could be fooling people into thinking she was getting better when she might actually be dying. A businessman across the aisle was still filming, his phone camera capturing everything, and Isaiah wanted to scream at him to help instead of record, to use his adult authority to demand the flight attendants provide care, to do something useful instead of treating Maya's suffering as content, but his voice was locked in his throat by the need to focus on his sister, on keeping her head positioned so she wouldn't hurt herself, on timing the seizure so he could report accurate information if anyone ever decided to listen. Other flight attendants had noticed the commotion. A younger woman named Sarah had approached and asked Christine what was happening, and Christine said dismissively, "Just a kid faking a seizure for attention. I've got it under control. The brother is being difficult, but they'll settle down." And Sarah looked uncertain, looked at Maya's convulsing form with visible doubt about Christine's assessment, but she deferred to the senior flight attendant's judgment, chose hierarchy over intervention, chose not to risk conflict with a colleague over helping a black child she didn't know, and her hesitation was another small violence, another moment when someone could have helped but chose not to, another second of delay that moved Maya closer to permanent injury. 6 minutes now, the seizure entering territory that definitely required emergency intervention, that meant Maya's brain was being damaged by the prolonged electrical storm, and Isaiah was sobbing openly saying, "Please somebody help her. There has to be a doctor on this plane. Please, if anyone has medical training, my sister is dying. Please, I can't do this alone." And his voice carried through the cabin, reaching passengers in the back who'd been unaware of the crisis unfolding in row 15, and finally someone responded, but the response wasn't help, wasn't the medical intervention Maya desperately needed, wasn't adults stepping up to save a child. Instead it was more passengers pulling out phones to film, more people shrinking back from the black children in the middle of a crisis, more whispered conversations about whether epilepsy was contagious despite Isaiah's repeated explanations. And the collective inaction felt like drowning, felt like being surrounded by people who could throw you a life preserver but were choosing to watch you go under instead. Maya's convulsions were continuing but changing character, her jerking movements becoming less rhythmic and more chaotic, her breathing shallow and labored, foam appearing at the corners of her mouth, all signs that Isaiah recognized from the seizure education materials their mother had made him study as indicating this was severe, this was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of episode that required immediate medical intervention and possibly emergency transport to a hospital. Please, Isaiah begged the cabin at large, not even directing his plea at Christine anymore because she'd made clear she wouldn't help, addressing instead the dozens of adults sitting in their seats watching a child suffer. Somebody has to know first aid, somebody has to have medical training. My sister has been seizing for almost 7 minutes. That's way too long. Her brain is being damaged right now. Every second we wait makes it worse. Please, I'm 14 years old and I don't know what else to do. Please don't let her die because you're scared or you don't want to get involved. A white man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit finally spoke up from 2 rows back, his voice carrying authority as he said to Christine, "This looks serious. Maybe we should get the medical kit and see if there's a doctor on board. Better safe than sorry." And Isaiah felt a flash of hope that maybe an adult white man's suggestion would carry weight that a black teenager's desperate pleas hadn't. Maybe Christine would listen to someone who looked like her, but Christine just shook her head and said with false patience, "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I'm trained to recognize when passengers are genuinely ill versus when they're seeking attention. This girl is fine. She'll stop this behavior when she realizes it's not working. Trust me, I've seen this before." The white man looked uncomfortable but didn't push back, didn't insist, didn't use his privilege or his apparent authority to override Christine's assessment, just settled back into his seat with a shrug that said, "Well, I tried." And Isaiah wanted to scream at him that trying wasn't enough, that suggestion without insistence was useless when a child was dying, that his comfort mattered less than Maya's life. 7 minutes into the seizure and Maya's lips were definitely blue now, her oxygen levels dropping as the prolonged convulsions taxed her respiratory system, and Isaiah could see her chest moving in rapid shallow breaths that weren't getting enough air, and he knew from the training that this was bad. This was the point where seizures could cause hypoxia that led to brain damage or death, and he felt panic rising in his throat, threatening to choke him because what if his sister died here in his arms while a plane full of adults watched and did nothing? What if the last thing he ever said to his parents was a promise he couldn't keep? What if Maya's last moments were on an aircraft floor being called a faker by someone whose job was to protect passengers? "Christine, I'm begging you," Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper now because his throat was raw from screaming, his tears making it hard to see. "Please look at her lips. They're blue. She's not getting enough oxygen. This is real. She's really dying. Please, you have the medical kit. Please just give her oxygen. Please, I can't watch my sister die. Please have mercy." Christine's expression finally shifted slightly, some flicker of uncertainty crossing her face as she seemed to actually look at Maya for the first time rather than just dismissing her, and she saw the blue lips, saw the shallow breathing, saw physical evidence that maybe this wasn't performance. But even then her response wasn't to help but to cover herself, and she said, "Well, if she's really having a medical episode then her family should have made sure she had proper supervision. Children with serious conditions shouldn't be flying alone. This is really on her parents for being irresponsible." The victim blaming was breathtaking. The suggestion that somehow their parents were at fault for Christine's refusal to provide care, and Isaiah felt something break inside him, felt the last thread of hope that adults would do the right thing snap under the weight of racism that would rather blame black parents than admit a white flight attendant had endangered a child. Other passengers were getting agitated now, some because they were starting to recognize this was a real emergency, some because the crying and commotion was disturbing their flight, and a college-age white girl said to her friend loud enough for Isaiah to hear, "Why don't they just make her stop? Like, this is so dramatic. Some people just want attention," and Isaiah wanted to turn around and scream at her that his sister couldn't stop, that epilepsy wasn't a choice, that her ignorance was contributing to Maya's death, but he couldn't spare the energy, couldn't take his focus off his sister whose seizure had now lasted 8 minutes. moving into territory where permanent damage was almost certain, where survival itself was becoming questionable. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent when someone needed help, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll be the voice that speaks up next time, because what happens in the next few minutes will show you what your silence costs when seconds matter and children are dying, will show you that filming isn't helping and watching isn't caring. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than your comfort, because this girl needed a plane full of adults to save her and got mostly cameras and fear. Maya's seizure was finally starting to slow, her movements becoming less frequent, but her eyes were still not focusing, still rolled back showing white, and Isaiah didn't know if this meant the seizure was ending or if her brain was just too exhausted to continue, didn't know if she'd wake up or if she'd suffered so much damage that she'd never be the same, and the uncertainty was torture. Was watching his sister exist in some liminal space between consciousness and potential death while adults who could have helped had chosen to watch instead, and then a voice cut through the chaos, a black woman's voice from the back of the plane saying, "Excuse me, let me through, I'm a doctor, move please, I need to get to that child." And Isaiah looked up through tears to see a woman in her 50s pushing through passengers who'd been content to film but weren't moving fast enough to let her pass. Dr. Patricia Williams had been sitting in row 28 trying to mind her own business, trying to enjoy a rare vacation after months of exhausting work at her emergency medicine practice, but she'd heard the commotion, had heard a child begging for help, had heard the flight attendant's dismissive responses, and she'd watched for 2 minutes hoping someone else would intervene, hoping she wouldn't have to get involved. But as the minutes stretched and the child's pleas became more desperate, she'd felt her professional obligation and her human conscience overriding her desire to stay out of it. And when the teenager had screamed that his sister was dying, she'd grabbed her medical bag from the overhead bin and started moving forward. "Excuse me," Dr. Williams said firmly to Christine, who was blocking the aisle, "I'm an emergency medicine physician and I need to assess this patient immediately. Please step aside." And Christine's face showed surprise and resistance as she said, "I have the situation under control. We don't need additional assistance. The girl is fine." But Dr. Williams pushed past her, saying that child has been seizing for over 8 minutes, which is a medical emergency. Now move or I'll have you charged with interfering with emergency medical care. Dr. Williams knelt beside Maya and immediately began a rapid assessment, checking her airway and breathing, noting the blue lips and shallow respirations, feeling for a pulse that was racing at dangerous speeds, observing the slowing but still present seizure activity, and her face showed the professional concern of someone who recognized this was critical, this was life-threatening, this was exactly the kind of pediatric emergency that required immediate intervention. "How long has she been seizing?" Dr. Williams asked Isaiah, her voice calm but urgent, and Isaiah said, 8 minutes. "Maybe 9 now. I tried to get help but nobody would listen." The flight attendant said she was faking, and Dr. Williams's jaw tightened with fury as she said to Christine, "You let a child seize for 9 minutes without intervention. Do you have any idea what you've done? This is status epilepticus. Her brain has been damaged, she could die or have permanent injury. Where is your emergency medical kit?" Christine stammered that she'd assessed the situation and determined it wasn't serious, that the girl appeared to be seeking attention, and Dr. Williams cut her off, saying, "Your assessment nearly killed this child. Get me the medical kit now, get me oxygen, and notify the pilot that we have a critical pediatric emergency that requires immediate landing. This girl needs to be in a hospital within minutes, not hours. Move now." The authority in Dr. Williams's voice finally penetrated Christine's resistance, and she hurried to retrieve the medical kit while another flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit to inform the captain, and Dr. Williams turned her attention back to Maya, positioning her head to maintain her airway, checking her vital signs, pulling out her own medical equipment to supplement whatever the airline kit contained. The seizure was ending finally, Maya's body going still in that terrible way that meant either rest or death, and Dr. Williams checked for breathing, for pulse, for any sign that Maya was coming back to consciousness, and she found a pulse weak and rapid, found breathing shallow but present, found a child who was alive but badly injured by the prolonged seizure and the delayed care. "She's stabilizing," Dr. Williams said to Isaiah, her voice gentle now as she recognized his terror. "She's breathing on her own, her heart is beating, but she's been seizing for too long. She's going to need immediate hospital care when we land. There may be brain damage, I won't lie to you about that." The prolonged seizure could have caused injury we won't know the extent of until she's evaluated, but she's alive and you did everything right by trying to get her help. Isaiah broke down completely then, sobbing with relief that Maya was alive, mixing with terror about what brain damage meant, with guilt that he hadn't protected her better, with rage at Christine and all the passengers who'd watched his sister suffer and done nothing. Dr. Williams put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You are incredibly brave. You fought for your sister when adults failed her. This is not your fault. This is on everyone who chose not to help." And her words were meant to comfort, but they just made Isaiah cry harder because bravery shouldn't have been necessary. A 14-year-old shouldn't have had to fight for basic medical care. His sister shouldn't have been endangered by racism that decided her seizure was probably fake. Dr. Williams got oxygen from the medical kit and placed the mask over Maya's face, monitoring her breathing and pulse. And she said to the flight attendants who were hovering uncertainly, "I need someone timing her vital signs every 2 minutes. I need someone getting me updates on our landing status. And I need everyone to back up and give this child space." And the crew jumped to follow her orders in ways they hadn't jumped to follow Isaiah's desperate pleas, responding to a doctor's authority. In ways they hadn't responded to a black teenager's medical emergency. Other passengers were finally reacting with appropriate concern, some looking ashamed, some asking if there was anything they could do, and Dr. Williams said sharply, "You can explain why you watched a child seize for 9 minutes without helping, you can explain why you filmed instead of intervening, you can live with knowing your silence contributed to whatever permanent damage this girl has suffered." The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing they were diverting to the nearest airport for a medical emergency, that they'd be landing in approximately 12 minutes, that emergency services would be waiting, and Isaiah felt time compressing and expanding weirdly because 12 minutes felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short, long enough for Maya to get worse, short enough that they might actually get her to a hospital before it was too late. Dr. Williams continued monitoring Maya's vital signs, noting that she remained unconscious, that her oxygen levels were slowly improving with the supplemental oxygen but were still lower than normal, that her pulse was beginning to slow from its dangerous racing to something closer to normal, all signs that suggested she might survive but didn't indicate whether she'd be okay, whether the 9 minutes of seizing had stolen parts of her brain that would never recover. Isaiah pulled out his phone again with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and he tried his mother's number one more time, listening to it ring and ring before going to voicemail, and he tried his father's number, hearing it go straight to voicemail indicating the phone was still off, and he felt the crushing weight of being alone in this crisis, of being a child carrying adult responsibilities, of needing his parents with desperate urgency and not being able to reach them, and the isolation was almost as painful as watching Maya seize, was its own kind of emergency that nobody could help with because the people he needed were unreachable, were going about their normal days completely unaware that their daughter was fighting for her life at 30,000 feet. "Mom, please answer," Isaiah whispered to his phone as it rang again, going to voicemail for the 4th time. "Maya needs you, I need you, something really bad happened and I don't know what to do, please check your phone, please call me back," and his voice broke on the last words. 14 years old and trying to hold himself together but fracturing under the weight of fear and responsibility and the knowledge that he'd promised to protect his sister and had failed. He tried the number for his cousin Andre, who they'd called earlier, hoping maybe someone in Miami could somehow help or at least know what was happening, but that call also went to voicemail, Andre probably at work or school with his phone silenced, completely unaware that the cousins who were supposed to arrive for a fun spring break week were instead in medical crisis. Isaiah left a stuttering message saying something bad happened to Maya, "We're making an emergency landing, she had a really bad seizure, I can't reach Mom or Dad, I don't know what to do," and he knew the message was probably incoherent but he couldn't form better words, couldn't make his brain work properly when Maya was lying unconscious a few inches away with an oxygen mask on her face and a stranger doctor monitoring her vitals. Dr. Williams looked at Isaiah with compassion and said, "Is there anyone I can try calling for you? Any other family members or emergency contacts?" And Isaiah pulled up his parents' information, gave Dr. Williams both their numbers, and watched as she tried calling and got the same results he had. Dr. Jennifer Carter's phone ringing endlessly before voicemail, Marcus Carter's phone switched completely off, and Dr. Williams's face showed frustration as she said, "I'm sorry, I know you need them. We'll keep trying. When we land, I'll make sure the hospital contacts them immediately through whatever means necessary. They will know what happened, I promise you won't be alone in this. The kindness in her voice made Isaiah cry harder because it highlighted how absent kindness had been from everyone else. How Christine and the other passengers had watched Maya suffer without offering even basic human compassion. How this stranger was showing more care in 5 minutes than the flight crew had shown in the entire crisis. The plane was descending now, the captain announcing they'd be landing in Fort Myers in 7 minutes, that emergency services were waiting, that passengers should remain seated with seatbelts fastened, and Isaiah felt time moving too fast and too slow simultaneously, desperate to get Maya to a hospital but terrified of what the doctors there would find, what damage had been done during those 9 minutes of uncontrolled seizure activity. Dr. Williams was talking to Maya even though she was unconscious, saying, "Maya, honey, you're going to be okay. We're getting you to a hospital. Your brother took such good care of you. You're safe now." And Isaiah didn't know if Maya could hear, but he appreciated Dr. Williams treating his sister like a person rather than a problem, like someone worthy of kindness and reassurance rather than suspicion and dismissal. Other passengers were silent now, the earlier chatter and filming replaced by uncomfortable quiet as people seemed to be processing what they'd witnessed, what they'd failed to do, and Isaiah could see shame on some faces, defensiveness on others, and complete indifference on a few who were just annoyed their flight was being diverted. The white woman who'd said epilepsy might be contagious was avoiding eye contact, was staring determinately at her phone, and Isaiah felt rage at her ignorance, at how her fear had contributed to the isolation that had made Maya's emergency worse, at how adults who should have known better had let prejudice and stupidity override basic human decency. The businessman who'd suggested getting medical help but hadn't insisted looked uncomfortable, kept glancing at Maya and then away, and Isaiah wanted to tell him that trying without succeeding was the same as not trying, that good intentions meant nothing when they didn't translate to action, that his comfort had mattered less than Maya's life, but he'd chosen comfort anyway. Christine Morrison was standing near the galley looking pale and shaken, perhaps finally understanding the severity of what had happened, what she'd allowed to happen through her refusal to take a black child's medical emergency seriously, and when she caught Isaiah's eye she looked away quickly, unable or unwilling to face the consequences of her racism. Sarah, the younger flight attendant who deferred to Christine's judgment, was crying quietly, and Isaiah felt no sympathy for her tears because she'd had the power to intervene and had chosen hierarchy over helping, had let a senior colleague's bad judgment become her own moral failure, had prioritized not making waves over saving a child's life. The plane touched down with a jolt that made Isaiah grab Maya's hand, and he felt her fingers still warm but unresponsive in his, felt the terrible stillness of her unconscious body, and he prayed to whatever forces controlled life and death that she would wake up, that the damage wouldn't be permanent, that their parents would forgive him for not protecting her better. Dr. Williams was already preparing for the transfer to paramedics, gathering her equipment and making sure Maya's airway remained clear, and she said to Isaiah, "When the paramedics come, I'll give them a full medical report. I'll tell them exactly what happened, including how long the seizure lasted and what interventions were delayed. That information will be important for her care and for any investigation into what happened on this flight." The plane taxied to the gate where emergency vehicles were waiting, their lights visible through the windows, and as soon as the aircraft door opened, paramedics rushed on with a stretcher and equipment, and Dr. Williams gave them a rapid professional summary saying 12-year-old female, known epileptic, sustained seizure lasting approximately 9 to 10 minutes before medical intervention was provided. Flight crew refused to assist despite being informed of the emergency. Patient has been postictal and unresponsive for the past 15 minutes. Vitals have stabilized but oxygen saturation remains low. Possible hypoxic brain injury from prolonged seizure, needs immediate hospital evaluation and likely ICU admission. The paramedics' faces showed concern and anger as they processed that a child had been allowed to seize for 10 minutes without help, and they moved efficiently to transfer Maya to their stretcher, to replace Dr. Williams's oxygen with their own, to begin transport to the nearest hospital. "Can I go with her?" Isaiah asked desperately. "She's my sister. I can't let her be alone. Please let me stay with her." And the lead paramedic looked at the situation, looked at this 14-year-old who was clearly traumatized and terrified, and said, "Yes, you can ride in the ambulance. We need to move fast though." And Isaiah grabbed their carry-on bags and followed as they wheeled Maya down the jetway, through the terminal where other passengers stared, into the waiting ambulance where medical equipment surrounded his unconscious sister, and he climbed in and sat in the small fold-down seat they indicated while paramedics worked around him, inserting an IV line into Maya's arm, attaching monitors that beeped with her heartbeat and oxygen levels, checking her pupils with a small flashlight, and all of it felt surreal, felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Felt like this morning's excitement about independent travel belonged to different children in a different universe where flight attendants helped instead of harmed. The ambulance siren wailed as they sped toward Lee Memorial Hospital, and Isaiah watched the paramedics work with practiced efficiency, watched them radio ahead to the emergency department with patient information, watched Maya's face for any sign of consciousness that didn't come, and he tried his parents' numbers again, his mother's phone ringing endlessly, his father's phone still completely off, and he felt abandoned even though he knew rationally they couldn't know were unreachable, not uncaring, but the emotional reality of needing them desperately and not having them was crushing him. The female paramedic whose name tag read Rodriguez noticed his repeated attempts to call and said gently, "Honey, we're going to have the hospital contact your parents through every means available. They'll use emergency notification systems if necessary. Your parents will know what happened very soon. I promise they won't leave you alone in this." And Isaiah nodded but didn't stop trying to call because doing something felt better than doing nothing, even when that something was futile. They arrived at the hospital and Maya was rushed into a trauma bay where doctors and nurses swarmed around her, and Isaiah was guided to a chair just outside where he could see through the glass but was out of the way, and a social worker appeared asking for parent contact information, for insurance details, for medical history, and Isaiah provided everything from memory and from the documents in their bag. The unaccompanied minor forms and medical documentation that should have protected Maya, but hadn't, that had been dismissed by Christine Morrison, who'd decided a black girl's seizure was probably fake. The social worker, whose name was Linda, made calls to both of Isaiah's parents, leaving urgent messages that included the words, "Your daughter Maya has been brought to Lee Memorial Hospital in Fort Myers following a medical emergency. Please call this number immediately." And Isaiah heard those messages being left and felt his heart breaking because that was how his parents were going to find out, through a stranger's voicemail, through the worst kind of notification, through words that would terrify them before they even knew the full story. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Maya remained unconscious while doctors ran tests and started medications, and Isaiah sat in that chair watching through glass and crying quietly, and then his phone rang with Dad calling, and Isaiah answered with shaking hands saying, "Dad," and Marcus Carter's voice came through tight with barely controlled panic saying, "Isaiah, what happened? I just got out of a board meeting and saw 17 missed calls. What's wrong? Where are you? Where's your sister?" Isaiah tried to explain, but the words came out in a rush of sobs and fragments. "Maya had a seizure on the plane, a really bad one, Dad. It lasted almost 10 minutes. The flight attendant wouldn't help us. She said Maya was faking. Nobody would help. People said it was contagious. I tried to call you but your phone was off. I couldn't reach you. And finally a doctor helped but it was too late. Maya's in the hospital now. She hasn't woken up. The doctors say there might be brain damage. Dad, I'm so scared. I promised I'd take care of her and I couldn't." The silence on Marcus's end lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt eternal, the sound of a father processing that his daughter was in a hospital, that she'd suffered a medical emergency while he was unreachable, that his son had faced a crisis alone, and when Marcus spoke again his voice was barely controlled, barely holding back either rage or tears or both, and he said, "Which hospital? Give me the exact name and address. I'm getting on a plane right now. Isaiah, you did everything right. This is not your fault. You hear me? You tried to get help and adults failed you. I'm coming, baby. I'm going to be there as fast as I can. Put me on speaker so I can talk to the doctors." Isaiah walked into the trauma bay where medical staff were working on Maya, and he said, "My dad is on the phone. He's her father. He needs to talk to someone." And a doctor took the phone saying, "Mr. Carter, this is Dr. James Morrison. I'm treating your daughter. She's stable but remains unconscious following a prolonged seizure. We're running CT scans and EEG monitoring to assess potential brain injury. She's receiving anti-seizure medication and supportive care. We'll know more in the next few hours." Marcus asked questions in the clipped professional tone he used when emotions were too big to show, asked about prognosis and treatment plan and whether Maya needed to be transferred to a larger facility, and Dr. Morrison answered each question with medical precision while Isaiah stood there feeling like he was watching this happen to someone else's family, like this couldn't be real, Couldn't be his sister lying there with tubes and wires. Couldn't be his father's voice breaking slightly when he asked if she was going to be okay. I can't give you certainties at this stage, Dr. Morrison said honestly. Prolonged seizures can cause varying degrees of damage. We won't know the full extent until she regains consciousness and we can assess her cognitive and motor function, but she's young and otherwise healthy, which works in her favor. We're doing everything we can. Marcus said he was 20 minutes from the airport, that he'd be in Fort Myers within 2 hours, that he'd already sent his assistant to pick up Dr. Jennifer Carter from her clinic, that Isaiah should stay with Maya and not be alone. And then his voice shifted from controlled to barely controlled as he said, Isaiah, I need you to tell me exactly what happened with the flight crew. I need every detail about who refused to help and what they said, because I'm going to make sure everyone who endangered my daughter faces consequences. And Isaiah recounted it all. Christine Morrison saying Maya was being dramatic, passengers claiming epilepsy was contagious, the 9 minutes of begging for help that no one provided, Dr. Patricia Williams finally intervening when Maya was already critically injured, and Marcus listened with silence that felt like fury compressed into absence of sound. When Isaiah finished, Marcus said very quietly, I let you travel alone. I told your mother it would be fine. I turned off my phone in a meeting like I always do, and because of my decisions our daughter is in a hospital with possible brain damage. I failed you both. I failed as a father. And Isaiah said, Dad, no, this isn't your fault. You didn't know this would happen. But Marcus said I should have known. I should have prepared for this possibility. I should have made sure my phone stayed on. Should have been reachable when my children needed me. Those are the things fathers are supposed to do, and I failed at all of them. And the self-recrimination in his voice was terrible to hear. Was a grown man breaking under the weight of guilt that Isaiah recognized because he was carrying the same burden, both of them blaming themselves for circumstances they couldn't have controlled, for racism they couldn't have predicted, for the cruelty of strangers who'd decided a black child's emergency wasn't worth their time. The call ended with Marcus promising to be there soon, promising that everything would be okay even though neither of them believed that promise, promising that people would be held accountable for what they'd done. And Isaiah sat back down in his chair outside the trauma bay and waited, watched doctors work on Maya through the glass, watched monitors display her vital signs in numbers he didn't fully understand but that seemed to indicate she was alive if not awake. An hour passed with no change in Maya's condition, her body still and small on the hospital bed, her face peaceful in a way that would have been comforting if it didn't mean unconsciousness, if it didn't represent brain injury that might be permanent. And Isaiah thought about this morning when they'd been excited, when Maya had been reading her book and laughing at something funny, when she'd been whole and healthy and full of plans for the week with their cousins, and he couldn't reconcile. That girl with this one couldn't understand how 9 minutes could steal so much. Dr. Williams arrived at the hospital having taken a taxi from the airport, and she found Isaiah in the waiting area and sat beside him and said, I wanted to make sure you weren't alone. I wanted to see how your sister is doing. And Isaiah felt gratitude mixing with grief because this stranger had shown more care than people whose job was caring, had followed up when she could have just walked away, had treated them like humans worth protecting. Marcus Carter arrived 90 minutes after his phone call, having chartered a private plane from Chicago to Fort Myers, and he burst into the emergency department looking like he'd aged years and hours, his suit rumpled from frantic travel, his face showing barely controlled panic. And he grabbed Isaiah and held him with crushing tightness saying, I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't there before. I'm here now. Where is she? Take me to your sister. Isaiah led his father to the trauma bay where Maya still lay unconscious, and Marcus stood at the doorway for a moment just staring at his daughter surrounded by medical equipment. And then he made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been rage, and he walked to her bedside and took her hand and said, Baby girl, Daddy's here. I'm so sorry I let this happen to you. And his tears fell onto the hospital blanket covering her small form. Dr. Morrison came to update them, explaining that the CT scan showed some concerning signs of hypoxic injury, that Maya's brain had been deprived of adequate oxygen during the prolonged seizure, that they wouldn't know the full extent of damage until she woke up and they could assess her cognitive function. And Marcus listened with the focused intensity of someone trying to understand information that would determine his daughter's future. What's the prognosis? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tears still on his face. Best case and worst case, I need to know what we're facing, and Dr. Morrison said honestly best case she wakes up with minimal deficits, some memory issues or processing delays that improve with therapy. Worst case she has significant cognitive impairment, motor function problems, personality changes. We've seen the full range with seizures of this duration. Every patient is different. Jennifer Carter arrived 30 minutes later, having been picked up from her clinic by Marcus's assistant and driven to a small airport where another chartered plane waited. And when she walked into that hospital room and saw her daughter unconscious, she broke in ways that a woman who'd spent her career treating sick children had never broken for other people's kids. Because this was Maya. This was her baby. This was the girl she'd read bedtime stories to and helped with homework and worried about every single day since the epilepsy diagnosis. Jennifer held Maya's other hand and examined the monitors with her medical knowledge, and she said to Dr. Morrison, "I'm a pediatrician. I understand the implications of prolonged seizure. I need you to tell me everything, all the details you'd give another physician," and Dr. Morrison walked her through the scans and the findings and the treatment plan. And Jennifer listened with professional composure that cracked when she asked the question every mother would ask, which was, will my daughter be okay? Will she be herself again? Both parents turned to Isaiah then and asked him to tell them exactly what had happened, and he recounted the entire nightmare, Christine Morrison's initial dismissiveness when he'd informed her about Maya's epilepsy during boarding, the seizure starting mid-flight, his desperate attempts to get help, Christine calling Maya dramatic and saying she was faking, passengers suggesting epilepsy was contagious, the 9 minutes of begging while Maya's brain was being damaged, Dr. Williams finally intervening, his inability to reach either parent, the terror of being 14 and watching his sister possibly die while adults refused to help. Marcus's face during this recounting cycled through emotions, grief to rage to guilt to determination, and when Isaiah finished, Marcus said very quietly that flight attendant's name was Christine Morrison, and Jennifer said yes, and Marcus pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first call was to his company's general counsel, Marcus saying, "I need you to immediately begin proceedings against Delta Airlines, against the specific flight attendants involved, against any passengers whose refusal to help can be documented. I want charges of medical negligence, child endangerment, discrimination, assault, everything that applies. I want depositions from every person on that flight. I want that flight attendant's employment history and any prior complaints. I want everything." And his voice carried the cold fury of someone who'd built a company through strategic action and was now deploying those same skills toward destruction of everyone who'd hurt his daughter. The second call was to a crisis management firm, Marcus explaining that his daughter had been endangered by airline staff, that the incident had probably been filmed by multiple passengers, that he wanted the story controlled and told correctly, that he wanted maximum pressure on Delta to take action. Jennifer was making her own calls, to Maya's neurologist in Chicago to consult on treatment, to specialists at children's hospitals who handled seizure-related brain injuries, mobilizing medical expertise the way Marcus was mobilizing legal and financial power, both parents doing what they could because doing something felt better than the helplessness of watching their daughter lie unconscious. Isaiah sat in the corner watching his parents work, watching them transform grief into action, and he felt simultaneously relieved that adults were handling things now and guilty that his relief implied he was glad to give up responsibility, as if Maya's injury was a burden he was passing off rather than a sister he loved more than anything. Hours passed in the strange time dilation of hospitals, and finally, near midnight, almost 12 hours after the seizure had started, Maya's eyes fluttered open, and Jennifer, who'd been holding her daughter's hand, felt the small movement and said, "Baby. Maya, baby, can you hear me?" And Maya's eyes opened fully but with a confusion that made Jennifer's breath catch because her daughter was looking at her without the immediate recognition that should have been there, without the spark of awareness that meant she understood who she was seeing. Maya's mouth moved but no sound came out at first, and then she whispered in a voice that sounded younger than her 12 years, slurred in ways that made the words hard to understand, "Where am I? What happened? Why does my head hurt so much?" And Jennifer smiled through tears and said, "You're in the hospital, sweetie. You had a seizure on the airplane, but you're safe now. Mommy and Daddy are here. Isaiah is here. You're going to be okay." But as the hours and then days passed, it became clear that okay was relative, that Maya had woken up but hadn't come back completely, that the 9 minutes of uncontrolled seizure activity while Christine Morrison refused to help had stolen parts of her brain that might never fully return. She struggled to remember things that had happened before the flight, couldn't recall conversations from the previous week, confused the names of her teachers and her friends, and when Isaiah tried to talk to her about their favorite books, she looked at him blankly and said, "I don't remember reading that," which broke his heart because they discussed that book just 2 days ago, had spent the car ride to the airport talking about the characters and the plot. Her speech remained slurred, words that should have come easily now requiring visible effort to form, her tongue not quite cooperating with her brain's instructions, making her sound like someone much younger, making communication frustrating for a girl who'd won writing competitions and loved to read. The neurologist who evaluated her, Dr. Sarah Chin, explained to the family that Maya had suffered hypoxic brain injury from the prolonged seizure, that the lack of adequate oxygen had damaged cells in multiple regions including areas responsible for memory formation and motor control, that with intensive therapy she might recover some function but that complete restoration was unlikely. She'll need speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, Dr. Chin said gently. She'll probably need educational support when she returns to school. Her processing speed has been affected, her working memory is impaired. These are real deficits that will impact her daily life. But children's brains have remarkable plasticity. She's young and she can learn to compensate for what's been lost. She can still have a good life even if it's different from what you'd hoped. Jennifer listened to this prognosis with professional understanding and maternal devastation, knowing as a doctor that Dr. Chen was being realistic, knowing as a mother that realistic meant her daughter would struggle with things that used to be easy, that Maya's dreams of being a writer might be complicated by cognitive issues that made sustained focus difficult. Marcus filed the lawsuits within a week of the incident, massive legal actions against Delta Airlines for negligence and failure to provide adequate medical care, against Christine Morrison personally for child endangerment and discrimination, against the airline's training programs for creating an environment where flight attendants felt empowered to ignore medical emergencies. And he used his connections throughout the aviation industry to ensure the case received attention, to ensure Delta understood they were facing an opponent with resources and determination that matched their own corporate power. The airline's initial response was defensive, lawyers suggesting that maybe the family was exaggerating Maya's condition, maybe she'd had underlying issues that made her more vulnerable, maybe Christine Morrison had acted reasonably given the information available, but those defenses crumbled when passenger videos surfaced showing Christine explicitly calling Maya's seizure dramatic and fake, showing 9 minutes of a child convulsing while an adult whose job was passenger safety stood there, refusing to help. Delta's investigation into the incident revealed that Christine Morrison had a history of complaints about her treatment of black passengers, incidents that had been documented but never resulted in serious discipline, the familiar pattern of institutions protecting problematic employees until their behavior became too public to ignore. She was terminated immediately once the videos went viral, once media coverage made her the face of medical racism in aviation, once keeping her employed became more expensive than the severance package her union contract required. Other flight attendants on the plane who'd deferred to Christine's judgment or who'd actively discouraged passengers from helping face suspensions and mandatory retraining, their careers damaged if not destroyed by their choices that day to prioritize comfort over courage, hierarchy over helping, professional protocol over protecting a child. The legal proceedings also targeted passengers who'd been documented on video refusing to help, particularly the woman who'd claimed epilepsy was contagious and the businessman who'd suggested getting help but hadn't insisted when Christine dismissed the idea. And while criminal charges against passengers were harder to pursue, the Federal Aviation Administration issued unprecedented suspensions of their flying privileges, banning them from commercial aviation for 6 months to a year, making clear that bystander indifference to medical emergencies had consequences. Some passengers complained this was unfair, that they weren't medical professionals, that they'd assumed the flight crew knew what they were doing, but the FAA's position was firm, pointing to the videos showing a child begging for help while adults filmed and watched, arguing that basic human decency required intervention when someone was clearly in distress regardless of whether you had medical training. Christine Morrison faced criminal charges as well, prosecutors in Florida bringing counts of child endangerment and reckless endangerment, arguing that her refusal to provide medical care had directly caused Maya's brain injury, that her racism had been so extreme it crossed from discrimination into criminal negligence. Her defense argued she'd made a judgment call in good faith, that she'd believed Maya was faking, that flight attendants couldn't be criminally liable for medical assessments made under pressure. But the jury watched the videos, heard Dr. Williams testify about the delay in care, heard Isaiah describe begging for help while his sister seized, and they deliberated less than 3 hours before convicting on all counts. The judge sentenced Christine Morrison to 8 months in county jail and 2 years probation, a relatively light sentence that reflected the court's uncertainty about criminalizing medical judgment calls but heavy enough to send a message that ignoring children's emergencies had real consequences. Maya spent 3 weeks in the hospital, then 2 months in intensive rehabilitation, learning to walk without stumbling, learning to speak without slurring, learning to focus long enough to read a paragraph, relearning skills that had been automatic before Christine Morrison decided a black girl's seizure wasn't worth her time. And every small victory like successfully pronouncing a difficult word or remembering what she'd eaten for breakfast felt bittersweet because these were things 12-year-olds shouldn't have to relearn, were abilities she'd possessed before racism and medical negligence had stolen them. The girl who'd won writing competitions now struggled to compose a coherent paragraph, her thoughts fragmenting before she could capture them on paper, her fingers not quite responding to the words her brain was trying to form, and she'd cry in frustration saying, "I used to be able to do this. Why can't I do this anymore?" And Jennifer would hold her and say, "You're getting better every day. You're working so hard. We're so proud of you." But maternal reassurance couldn't undo the fundamental truth. That Maya had been changed, had lost parts of herself that might never return no matter how much therapy she completed or how hard she tried. Isaiah carried guilt that therapy couldn't fully address, waking from nightmares where he watched Maya seize while he stood frozen, unable to help, unable to make the adults listen, unable to protect the sister he'd promised to care for, and his grades suffered his first semester back at school because concentration was impossible when his mind kept returning to that aircraft, to the 9 minutes that had felt like eternities, to the faces of passengers who'd filmed instead of helping. He developed anxiety around medical situations, would panic if Maya showed any signs of being unwell, would hover over her checking that she'd taken her medication, that she wasn't too stressed, that nothing would trigger another seizure that he might not be able to stop, and his parents had to gently explain that he couldn't live his whole life in fear of what might happen, that controlling everything was impossible, that he needed to let go of the responsibility that had been forced on him. Too young. The civil lawsuit against Delta Airlines settled 8 months after the incident for an undisclosed sum rumored to be in the tens of millions, money that would fund Maya's ongoing medical care and educational support for the rest of her life, that would ensure she had resources to compensate for the cognitive deficits she'd carry forward. But money felt hollow measured against what had been lost. Felt like the airline was buying absolution for harm that couldn't be undone with any amount of financial compensation. Marcus had wanted to take the case to trial, had wanted a public reckoning where every detail of Delta's failures would be exposed, where Christine Morrison's history of racism would be documented in court records, where the institutional rot that had protected her would be laid bare. But Maya's doctors advised that the stress of trial would be harmful to her recovery, that she needed stability and routine rather than months of legal proceedings that would keep the trauma fresh and prevent healing. Delta implemented sweeping policy reforms as part of the settlement, mandatory medical emergency training that emphasized taking passenger reports seriously regardless of the passenger's race, independent review processes for complaints about flight crew discrimination that couldn't be buried by individual managers, protocols requiring immediate response to seizures and other obvious medical crises. Changes that represented significant improvement over previous policies, but that came too late. For Maya, that wouldn't give her back what she'd lost but might protect future passengers from experiencing similar negligence. The reforms included partnerships with medical organizations to develop better training materials, requirements that at least one crew member on every flight have advanced first aid certification, and zero-tolerance policies for any crew member who refused to provide emergency medical assistance. And aviation industry publications covered these changes as groundbreaking even though they were really just codifying what should have been common sense, which was that when someone is having a medical emergency you help them regardless of what they look like. If this story broke your heart, if it made you think about times you witnessed someone in distress and didn't help, if you understand now that silence and inaction can literally kill people, then subscribe to this channel and commit to being the person who intervenes next time, who speaks up when someone needs help, who refuses to let prejudice override emergency care. Because Maya needed a plane full of adults to save her and got mostly cameras and fear, and your courage could be the difference between someone living with their full abilities or living with permanent disability caused by preventable delay. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than your comfort or your assumptions about who deserves help. Maya returned to school 10 months after the seizure, entering 7th grade with accommodations that included extra time on tests, a note-taker to help with her processing difficulties, and regular breaks to prevent cognitive fatigue. And she struggled in ways that were heartbreaking to watch because she remembered being better at this. Remembered when reading came easily and writing flowed naturally and focusing didn't require exhausting effort. Her teachers were kind and patient, but Maya could see the difference between how they treated her now versus before, could feel herself being handled carefully like something fragile, could sense their lowered expectations even though they tried to hide them, and she told her mother, "I don't want to be the girl with brain damage, I want to be Maya who loves books and wants to be a writer," but Jennifer had to explain gently that she was still that Maya, just a Maya who'd been hurt and was learning to work with the brain she had now rather than the brain she used to have. Isaiah graduated high school with honors despite his struggles, and he chose to study emergency medicine in college, his career path shaped entirely by that day on Flight 3241 when he'd learned that medical care could be delayed or denied based on racism, that people could die not because help wasn't available but because help was withheld by those who decided certain lives weren't worth saving. He wanted to be the kind of doctor who treated every patient as deserving of care, who never let prejudice override protocol, who intervened when others stayed silent, his entire professional identity built on ensuring no child would experience what Maya had experienced if he had any power to prevent it. Christine Morrison served her 8 months in jail, emerged with no career prospects in aviation and limited options elsewhere given that Googling her name produced thousands of articles about the flight attendant who'd let a black girl's seizure cause brain damage, and she lived the rest of her life defined by her worst decision, by the 9 minutes when racism had overridden her duty to help, by the child whose future she'd permanently altered through her refusal to believe that black pain was real. Maya at 16 was different than she would have been, slower in some ways, still struggling with complex tasks that required sustained focus, still carrying the effects of hypoxic brain injury that therapy had improved but not eliminated, but she was also stronger in ways that mattered, more determined, more aware of injustice and more willing to speak about it. And she'd written an essay about her experience that had been published in a medical journal, her words still sometimes halting but her message clear, which was that medical racism killed people every day, that believing black patients when they reported symptoms and emergencies was literally a matter of life and death, that her brain damage was preventable and existed only because adults had decided a 12-year-old black girl's seizure was probably fake, and her story had changed training protocols and touched hearts and maybe, hopefully, saved others from experiencing what she'd experienced, which didn't make it worth. It didn't balance the scales, but at least meant her suffering hadn't been completely meaningless, that something good had emerged from something terrible, that Christine Morrison's cruelty had been met with Maya's courage.